It began as so many stories of suburban warfare do, with a letter. A polite one, printed on stiff cream paper with an embossed logo at the top, the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. It was addressed to one man, Thomas Wilkes, and it contained exactly 13 words that would ignite one of the most absurd and fascinating neighborhood battles in modern history. You are in violation of Community Code 4.3, unauthorized vessel mooring. That unauthorized vessel was a 40-foot yacht named the Resolute, gleaming white and proudly docked in the center of the artificial lake behind Thomas's home. The yacht wasn't just any boat. It was a monument to his late father, a naval engineer who had built ships for a living and dreamed of owning one of his own. When Thomas bought the house, an elegant modern estate on the lake's edge, he had imagined peaceful evenings aboard, sipping coffee on deck, watching the sun shimmer across the calm water. But the HOA apparently had other visions. They demanded he move it. Thomas refused. And what followed would become legend. A war of wills that would end with Thomas owning not just the yacht, but the entire lake, and evicting the very people who tried to control him. Thomas Wilkes wasn't the type to start trouble. In fact, by most accounts, he was quiet, methodical, even a little reclusive. A software developer turned early crypto investor, he'd moved to Lakeside Meadows for peace. The HOA's initial fine, a modest $500, barely registered. But when he ignored it, the letters grew sharper, the fines steeper. $1,000, then $5, then $10. The HOA president, a man named Carl Henderson, took it personally. Carl fancied himself a keeper of order. The lawns must be trimmed to regulation height, trash bins hidden from sight, and no boats, yachts, or watercrafts larger than 12 feet allowed on the community lake. Carl saw Thomas's yacht not as a tribute to a father, but as an act of rebellion. Neighbors whispered. The yacht was an eyesore, they said. Others admired it in secret, watching it gleam at sunset, wondering how one man could stand so defiantly against the system. But the real turning point came when Thomas received the third letter, this time threatening legal action. He smiled, poured himself a coffee, and made a single phone call. To a lawyer. Not to fight the fine, but to buy the lake. Now, Lakeside Meadows had been built decades ago on private land owned by a real estate developer who'd kept the lake under a separate holding company. The HOA leased usage rights but didn't actually own the water. Most residents didn't know this. But Thomas, being the detail-oriented type, had done his research. So when the original developer, long retired and living in Florida, received an unexpected offer for the lake and its surrounding property, he didn't hesitate. Within 6 weeks, Thomas Wilkes became the new owner of Lakeside Meadows Lake and the narrow strip of land encircling it. When the paperwork was finalized, he sent a letter of his own. Effective immediately, all access to the lake is restricted to authorized individuals. Violations will result in trespassing charges. It was signed simply, Thomas A. Wilkes, owner, Lakeside Property Holdings, LLC. The neighborhood erupted. Carl Henderson called an emergency HOA meeting. Neighbors packed the clubhouse, voices rising, arguments breaking out over property rights, contracts, and community covenants. But the legal reality was undeniable. Thomas owned the lake. The HOA had no authority over it anymore. Carl accused him of malicious intent. Others pleaded for compromise. But Thomas didn't show up to the meeting. He was instead out on the Resolute, enjoying a quiet evening on the deck with a glass of wine, listening to the echoes of outrage drift across the water. In the weeks that followed, the story exploded beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations picked it up first, dubbing him the man who bought the lake. Then national outlets joined in. Some saw him as a folk hero, a symbol of resistance against overreaching HOAs. Others called him vindictive, a petty tyrant who'd used wealth to humiliate his neighbors. But Thomas wasn't done. He took it further. The HOA, desperate to regain control, filed a lawsuit claiming his ownership invalidated community easements. But Thomas's lawyers were relentless. They found old contracts, loopholes, and technicalities the HOA had never bothered to check. Every claim fell apart. Then came the final twist. The HOA, unable to use the lake, found itself in violation of its own charter. Many of the homes had been advertised as lakefront properties with shared access. Without that access, their property values plummeted. Residents began moving out. The once idyllic neighborhood started to crumble. Thomas began buying the vacant homes. One by one. He turned some into guest houses, others into workshops, and a few into short-term rentals. Within 3 years, he owned over half the neighborhood. Carl Henderson, the HOA president, was one of the last to leave. His house sold at a loss. His dream of suburban order drowned in the very lake he'd tried to control. But here's the strangest part. Thomas never sought revenge for its own sake. In interviews years later, he spoke calmly, even wistfully about what happened. "I didn't want to fight," he said. "I wanted peace. But sometimes peace requires taking back what's yours." And in that single line lies the bizarre paradox of the story. It wasn't about a yacht. Not really. It was about control, about freedom, about one man refusing to be told what to do on property he owned, and a system unable to tolerate that defiance. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of it. A millionaire buying a lake to win an argument. But beneath the humor is something universal. Who hasn't felt that frustration with bureaucracy? Who hasn't wondered how far they'd go to stand their ground? There's a quiet satisfaction in seeing an individual outwit a rigid institution. Yet there's also an unease, a question of whether power in any form ever leaves room for fairness. Today, Lakeside Meadows no longer exists under that name. Thomas dissolved the HOA entirely after acquiring majority ownership, renaming the area Resolute Shores after his father's yacht. The lake is open again, but only to those invited. Sometimes locals say you can see him out there still, an older man now, sitting alone on the deck, reading by lantern light as the water ripples softly beneath him. There are rumors, of course, that the old HOA members occasionally drive by just to look. That one former board member tried sneaking onto the property one night and found a no trespassing sign nailed to a dock post with the words HOA Free Zone carved beneath it. Whether that's true or not hardly matters, because in the end, Thomas Wilkes did something few ever manage. He beat the system at its own game. He didn't just refuse to move his yacht. He moved the line between control and independence and dared everyone else to follow. But this story isn't just about one man's defiance. It's about the strange evolution of American neighborhoods, the rise of the HOA empire, the battle between conformity and individuality, and the surprising power of ownership in a world built on rules. Homeowners associations, for all their intentions to preserve order and value, have become symbols of something deeper. The quiet tug of war between personal liberty and collective control. They can fine you for your paint color, your mailbox, your weeds, and in Thomas's case, your yacht. And yet, Every so often, someone like Thomas comes along to remind us that even the most rigid systems have cracks, if you know where to look. When asked years later if he regretted it, if it was worth the money, the effort, the infamy, Thomas just smiled. He looked out over the lake, calm and silver in the morning light. Regret, he said. No. I got exactly what I wanted. A little peace and quiet. And with that, he turned back to the Resolute, the same yacht that had started it all, and disappeared into the cabin, the sound of the water lapping softly against the hull. In a world full of rules, there's something intoxicating about the person who decides to write their own. Whether we call it rebellion or justice, it's the kind of story that makes us ask ourselves, if they find you for your dream, what would you do? Would you move your yacht? Or buy the lake?